Right. So we're very happy to be here today with Alyssa Battistoni, who is the author of a book called Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. And welcome to earth.org.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So please tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be writing about natural capital.
So I am a political theorist. I have been thinking about climate change and environmental politics for a long time now, actually, ever since kind of got made my way into climate politics through Hurricane Katrina now 20 years ago. But the thing that I was interested in as I started working on this book was the way that so much of our environmental and climate politics had been framed in terms of this question of economics, or in economic terms, as problem of missing prices, where either we talk about the missing cost of carbon emissions, that they're not sort of factored into prices, or on the other hand, that many of the ecosystems and various elements of the natural world that keep our planet habitable are also not accounted for in our conventional economic systems. And so that was the register in which kind of all of the, environmental and climate politics were happening, that most of the programs on the table were efforts to, in one way or another, internalize the externalities, to put a price on carbon or to put a price on ecosystems. And so I wanted to understand sort of, what these were, why this was the case, how we might think about those kinds of programs.
I mean, right from the start of the book, you choose your terminology very carefully. Even going so far as the title, which is not gift, but free gifts. So tell us, what is the difference between a gift and a free gift when
Yeah,
it
the
comes
free
to
gift is
natural
a
capital?
absolutely, and the free gift I think is a very an interesting and strange concept. It's not originally my concept. It's one that I take from um, classical political economists who are writing in the 18th and 19th centuries and describing the contributions that nature makes to production, everything from sheep organs to soil fertility to the pressure of steam. And they're describing all of these kinds of elements of nature and the gifts they give gratuitously and freely to production. But I think this idea that there's such a thing as a free gift is actually quite a strange one, because the free gift is it seems like a contradictory concept in a way, either redundant or oxymoronic, because usually we think of a gift as something that isn't bought and sold by definition. You kind of give a gift, you receive a gift, but you don't buy a gift, or you might buy it for someone else, but you're not how you sort of the mode of acquiring a gift takes place through some other kind of mechanism. And in a lot of cultures, the idea of a gift is something that you have to reciprocate. It's sort of something fundamentally defined by return, that you can't really, that there is no such thing as a free gift, because it incurs these kinds of obligations and reciprocal expectations. So a free gift doesn't really make sense in that context. So the free gift, I think, is again this sort of strange designation that I think really points us to the status of the free gift in within capitalism, within a system sort of organized around the market and around the exchange of commodities in the market, where most things are bought and sold. And so it becomes notable that something is free, as in the sense of costless or priceless, or something that you don't have to buy and sell, because most of the things that we acquire in capitalist societies, you do have to pay for. And so when something is free, it's significant and it stands out, and that's what I wanted to investigate.
I mean, you mentioned a minute ago the type of things that nature provides us with that we don't necessarily think of as think of valuing. I think you mentioned sheep organs a minute ago. So what are some examples of the types of services that nature provides us with that ought to be
So
valued?
today, yeah, so today I think a lot of the category of free gifts would describe what we tend to describe, or what's often thought of in terms of ecosystem services or natural capital, these elements of the biosphere, processes and services, from carbon sequestration was one of the most sort of well known at this point, but there are a lot of other things that ecosystems do. They filter water, they regenerate soil, they often generate a number of forms of wild plants and animals that some people rely on for subsistence. There are some creatures that pollinate plants and crops. There's just so many things that kind of just go into the remaking of our world on a daily basis, without which human life, but also life in general, wouldn't continue to exist as we know it. And all of those things are done for free. That we they're just happening in the background all the time, and for the most part, no one is paying for them.
I mean, that's an interesting concept to think of trying to pay for services. And I think I only heard the term ecosystem services or natural capital something like maybe 10 years ago at the most. But I was very surprised to read in your book that these concepts arose much earlier. I mean, can you maybe tell us a little bit about the history of these concepts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that there was a kind of big peak of discussion of ecosystem services around 10 years ago, though there's been like another revival recently. But it really is this concept that goes back in some ways quite a long time. But I would say the real evolution of the concept as we talk about it now is in the late 60s and early 70s, and that kind of moment of the environmental movement and growing environmental and ecological consciousness. And it really originates as a metaphor in a lot of ways. There are a number of environmental writers, from ecological economists like Herman Daly to activists like Barry Commoner, and people like E.F. Schumacher, all of these people who are trying to sort of draw attention to the significance and the importance of these various ecosystemic activities and processes, and they describe them as natural capital or biological capital. They're trying to use this sort of like economic metaphor to just basically to describe how valuable these things are, even though they don't have a price. And from there is really, it starts kind of metaphorically, but increasingly there's an effort to really start to define and understand what these services are and to measure them, and try to assess, what in some crude approximation is their value in economic terms. And you see this evolution of a body of work in ecology, that's trying to identify, particular what are these services, how we estimate their value, and a lot of that is happening in response to various kinds of environmental legislation that are trying to looking for cost benefit analyses that want to know, like, if we protect this wetland, what are we getting for that? Why would we do that, like, rather than develop it in some way? And so, over the course of the 70s and 80s, it's this sort of growing body of work trying to both assess and estimate the value of ecosystem services. But then they really kind of come into their own in the 90s and 2000s, with a new push to kind of realize these in some way, or to make them operative in the world.
You mentioned there's a legislative push towards this. Where are we seeing that?
I'm not sure there's a big legislative push now, although there are in some places. But I think a lot of the early development of ecosystem services evaluations and estimations was a response to legislation that required the government to assess, like, the benefits of different government programs. So if you were going to, it would be something like an environmental review type thing, but basically to estimate what whether the benefits of a particular project would outweigh the costs. And so they needed to tell us what, like, is this wetland absorbing X amount of storm surge? Is it worth preserving or protecting? Today, I think there are some efforts to incorporate natural capital assessments into some, again, usually governmental or sort of public body assessments. There have been some occasionally in the U.S. The U.K. has often been a leader of ecosystem accounting, but there's not sort of and then there are various versions of efforts to incorporate some form of ecosystem service valuation in the form usually of things like subsidies paid to farmers, for instance, for preserving particular patch of forest, or for farming and more in ways that are sustaining and regenerating the soil more sustainably. So there's various programs that are trying to put this into operation, but it's never really been, like, fully, I would say, integrated into any sort of legislative program.
I mean, recently at COP30, we saw the beginning of the TFFF, the Tropical Forest. I can't remember whatever the two F's stand for. Funding facility, something like that. And this was an interesting one because it really attempted to put a price per hectare on the the value that forests bring to us. I think it's four US dollars per hectare of forest protected and minus 100 something or 200 something for a per hectare forest that's destroyed. Do you think this kind of thing is a good idea? Do we want to have standards like this? Is that helpful to put a dollar value on a hectare of forest?
Yeah, it's been a much debated question. Like, should we price nature? If the problem is that nature isn't being evaluated in terms of price and isn't being accounted for, should we price it and incorporate it? And I think, I guess there are a couple of ways that I think about it. One is that I think it's often been criticized as being really economistic or instrumentalizing because there's something sort of morally wrong with putting a price on the
Mm,
forest or assigning a dollar value. And I'm very sympathetic to a lot of those critiques, but I think they often can uh, miss a couple of points. And one of the things that I think is useful about the exercise of trying to say like what what this forest is worth is that often when you look at like how they're calculating the value, it's really interesting to see what kinds of services they're describing. What
mm,
is it that the forest is doing that is worth $4 or negative $200 or whatever it may be. There's this effort to really evaluate and assess and think about what are the different things that we need this ecosystem for, or this particular set of the species, or patch of land, or whatever it may be. What is it doing for us, and how can we recognize that in some other way? And the price is often. So I always say think of it less as a price because these things usually aren't being bought and sold. It's kind of
mhm,
like a way to call attention again to the significance of that, the importance of these things for our lives, and the both again human life and also non-human life. So I think they can be revealing in some way, and can sometimes the estimates can be incredibly high. There was a famous study that estimated the value of the entire biosphere at $33 trillion. But I think what's often more pertinent is that these things, again, are estimates. They come up, with sometimes like this is what the value of this force should be, but they're very rarely actually forests are very rarely being actually bought and sold on like a
mhm,
market as we would conventionally think of it. Sometimes they're incorporated into national accounts, or they're used to make policy, or there might be some kind of mechanism where wealthier countries are paying developing countries that still have a large amount of forest to preserve
mhm,
those forests rather than cut them down. So there's sometimes like programs that are basically attempts to subsidize the preservation of some of these
mhm,
ecosystems. But it's not the way that we think about like I go to the store and I buy like a candy bar or something. You're not doing
mhm,
that with like the forest. And a lot of the efforts to really generate these in terms of credits or some kind of markets and
mhm.
biodiversity or services have been very unsuccessful.
And indeed, the type of pricing you talk about, I believe the initial estimate of 30 something trillion was later revised to 125 trillion. And I think most of us would be a little bit put out if the candy bar we went to the grocery store for was, changed its price, but that dramatically within a short period of time. Um, and I mean, so that makes me think that these are much more about some something nebulous themselves, something like awareness raising of the value, or even the process itself, as you mentioned, can be interesting just to put some transparency on what are the ecosystem services, whatever the price we may put on them, just literally knowing what they are to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. I think the study that was where they estimated the value of the biosphere at $33 trillion got a ton of negative feedback because people thought it was, appalling that you would value the entire earth in terms of
Mm,
price. And they were just like, look, we're trying to raise awareness. We're trying to it's almost so
hmm
absurd. We're trying to shock you a little bit with like this crazy number that obviously no one is going to pay that. That's not
right.
feasible or desirable, but we want to kind of get your attention and make people think about this a little bit more.
I mean, the same thing. I think you pointed out that some other study had valued the each whale at 2 million US dollars, and I think so that means all whales are worth $1 trillion US dollars. So would we be willing to pay $1 trillion for to keep all the whales on Earth? I mean, that's a question that might never come up, but it's almost an absurd question.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something that I think people always find it, yeah, kind of absurd and kind of funny almost when you sort of
Mm,
point to the, okay, like a whale is worth $2 million, all the whales are worth $1 trillion, which is, like a fraction of like Apple or Nvidia or one of these sort of,
hmm
really hot companies. So there is always something, something that is both revealing and it can be unsettling, but again, I think that's often the point. And in any case, you actually cannot go out there and just sort of buy a whale for $2 million. It is not
I've
actually
never
an
tried,
option to
mind
any
you, but there's
of
always a first time. Um, and a lot of what you just mentioned about the difficulty of creating a value, but at the same time understanding that these services are, in a certain sense, priceless, reminded me a lot of the discussions we see in the corporate world about things like, functions like human resources or administration or admin, who are these maintenance services that keep a corporation alive, but nobody notices them unless things go wrong. And that's something you bring up, is the value of maintenance services, which are impossible to maximize through capitalism. And the area I think in particular, which particularly struck me, was the comparison of that to, let's call it, reproductive services or women's work. And I learned a new word from your book, which was housewifeization. And so tell me about this looking at this through a gender lens.
Yeah, there is this interesting parallel, I think, between the status of unvalued ecosystemic activity and um, these kinds of human labor, which we often talk about as housework or domestic work or reproductive work that we everyone recognizes are extremely socially valuable and necessary and important, but that are often unwaged or paid quite poorly relative to other kinds of work. And so, in a lot of ways, this was one of the questions that animated the book at the beginning. 'Cause I was interested in feminist critiques of unwaged labor, the sort of question of why are these kinds of work repeatedly unpaid, and why, that there's a problem here with the failure of capitalism to value certain kinds of human labor. And so I think it is really, interesting to see these parallels and to try to understand what the parallel is. Sometimes I think people have conceived that in terms of the status of women, where women are understood as part of nature or thought to be part of nature. And so there's some kind of like ideological work happening where, women are treated as nature. And so the work they do is treated as a free gift of nature and kind of taken for free. And I think that that's not totally untrue, but I think what is more significant is something about the sort of physical activities of reproducing life and the kinds of ways that is very difficult to mechanize and industrialize and speed up,
Mm,
and that there is something I think very similar about the activity of reproducing human life and the kind of processes and activities that are required to regenerate non-human life and
mm,
ecosystem, to regenerate these ecosystem services. Neither of them are easily kind of made into that model that we think of as sort of the pinnacle of capitalist production, like the industrial factory, where everything
mm,
is just sort of moving down the assembly line really quickly, and you can kind of keep it running all day and all night, and speed things up according to the clock. And that's just not how human bodies work or ecosystems work. They work on their own time,
mm,
their own sort of concrete rhythms that are very hard to sort of make fit into this other this very hyper efficient model of production. And so I think often, they're not worth investing in because they're really hard to squeeze that extra profit out of if you're trying to compete with others, with other capitalists, with other investors. You're probably not going to put your money into something that, takes a really long time to develop, that has all these interruptions where things might go wrong because there's like a drought or a flood or a fire, maybe
Mm,
your whole forest burns down or something. It's not a very good deal, basically. So I think that's actually very important for both why a lot of these kinds of reproductive labor done by human beings are often not waged because they're not very attractive to investment. But I think the same is true for ecosystem services. That there are
mm.
these things that just kind of uh, uh, don't really appeal to investors. And indeed, we've seen very little private investment in things like natural capital and ecosystem services, despite a long effort to kind of attract that kind of investment.
Hmm. No, it's true. I mean, if you pay a woman more, the baby is still going to be born in 9 months. It's not going to not going to happen any faster.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
I mean, having said all this, a lot of the book, and I want to say the first half to two-thirds is almost much more of a work of philosophy than anything else. And I think in great throughout the book you view the subject through the lens of Marxism. And so maybe this is a question. What do you think Karl Marx would have thought of today's discussions around natural capital?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, it is a work of political theory and philosophy, and very much in a Marxist vein. And um, Marx, I think would find these discussions, I hope, quite interesting. I do think that Marx remains our best sort of critic of capitalism and guide to understanding capitalism from a critical perspective. And so I really, that's why I draw on his work and thinking through, what the status of nature and contemporary capitalist society is. And I think he would be both, you know, maybe in some ways, I think not as surprised as we might think by some of the kinds of ecological degradation that have happened over the past, 150 years or so, because he was quite attentive to a number of the ways that capitalist agriculture eroded the soil and things like that in his own time. And he was, I think also attuned to the kinds of the ways that nature could be quite useful even where it wasn't priced, where it wasn't sort of
Hmm.
turned into a commodity. And there are places where he mentions some of the things that, like virgin forests and air and all these things do. So I think he would be, it was never something he'd spent a ton of time writing or thinking about in a dedicated way. But I think you would recognize many of the processes that have brought us to this point. And I would love to read his book on natural capital. I think the thing he might be surprised by is how much the extent to which capitalism has not kind of made inroads into certain
Hmm.
sectors that there have been these places, because we tend to think of capitalism as commodifying everything, kind of bringing everything inside, absorbing everything, and it hasn't done that with a lot of elements of the natural world, and that you know I don't know if it would come as a total surprise to Marx because he also notes places where that happens, but that the extent to which some of these processes have remained beyond capitalist organization might be an interesting fact for him.
I mean, as you point out, it's not for lack of trying. In the past few years, you say that there's companies that have been established. They're trying to price nature as an asset class, for example. And
Yeah.
maybe to wrap up, well, let's hear what do you think is the future of such endeavors? What will we see next from this type of arrangement? Maybe the conflict or the tension between nature as an asset class and capitalism trying to price it, and the impossibility or possibility of doing any such thing.
Yeah, I think we will continue to see efforts to make nature into some kind of commodity or asset class or a new growth sector. And this has happened, in the past. I think it will continue. We're in a new wave. I think we'll continue to see these efforts to kind of tap the wealth of nature and make that into a site of growth and investment. But I do think that those are going to continue to fail because it is a really difficult project. It requires a huge amount of such a huge amount of work to kind of construct these
Hmm.
markets and make these commodities to make, you can't just kind of go out and like pick carbon sequestration off a tree the way you can pick an apple off. You have to kind of do all of this work to assess how much
Hmm.
carbon is being sequestered and certify that and create a credit that some kind of a state will like recognize and as part of a market and back. And there are all these things
Mm.
that are very difficult. You have to create demand. You have to make people buy them. So I think these are going to continue to fail, frankly. And I think if we want to be protecting these kinds of ecosystem services and natural capital, I think a far better route is to treat them as some kind of public service or public good that
Mm.
requires public investment and protection as a much more straightforward way to make sure that they continue functioning and providing the services that we do need to survive. So I hope that that's at some point people will recognize the kind of the futility these efforts to make natural capital profitable.
Mm.
But I'm sure there will be another wave at some point.
Right. Well, the book is Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, and we've been talking to Alyssa Battistoni. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.